he casually asks him, "Golly, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And Jesus probably asked Philip because he came from Bethsaida, a place not far away. So if anyone knew that area, Philip should. And Philip answers in the spirit of the question, doesn't he? Jesus is talking about funding an emergency feeding project. So instead of saying, "Well, you're the miracle worker," because Jesus has asked it in those terms, Philip sticks to the practicalities. He does a bit of math and comes up with the fact that not even 8 months' wages for an average person would even touch the cost of feeding that number of people. And the language of his reply just underlines the complete hopelessness of the situation. For Philip, it is a non-starter, not even the remotest possibility. Meanwhile, of course, another disciple has taken a bit of initiative and has found a boy. In fact, the language is that of a double diminutive. I didn't know these existed, apparently, but they do. This is a double diminutive, which means he found a little boy. Not just a boy, but a little boy. And fortunately, he has a picnic. Hurrah! It's the first bit of food they found. Unfortunately, it's only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. To be exact, as John is, it's 5 barley loaves, which were the cheapest. They were the coarsest bits of bread you could buy. They would never make it into the bake-off tent. This was poor people's bread. And the lake was a great source of fish, which were then pickled and they were exported, sent all around the Roman Empire as snack food. So his mum had probably popped a couple of pickled fish in to make the bread a little bit more palatable. And that was it. In reality, they were no further forward. And we might be tempted to read this and think, well, it's a bit like communion. We're going to share that in a minute, where we're just going to take a little bit of bread, a little bit of wine, as it were. It's a symbolic meal. That's what must have happened. They all had just a crumb or two between them. Or we might think, well, actually what really happened was that little boy and his generosity, fantastic. It triggered an outpouring of generosity and everybody shared their picnics. But this miracle is in each of those 4 Gospels. And it is arguably the one witnessed by the most people, at least 10,000 people, at a time when there were only about 500,000 people living in the whole country. So if the Gospels had got it wrong, there will be plenty of people to say it happened differently. And what John and Mark and Matthew and Luke make clear is that something extraordinary, something amazing happened on that hillside. Jesus gave thanks, and those barley loaves were distributed, and that fish was distributed, and all had enough to eat. No pinch and snip nibbles here. They ate their full, and there were 12 baskets left over. And just 3 things stand out for me this morning. Firstly, the little boy. There were, as I keep saying, at least 10,000 people on that hillside. Probably some important men and women amongst them. But apart from Jesus and a couple of his disciples, the only other person to get a mention is the little boy. And remember the double diminutive. John could not be clearer. This is no strapping lad. This was a little boy. And when Andrew had asked if anyone had any food, this boy, who from the fact that his mother could only afford barley loaves, this was a boy who knew poverty and probably knew he wouldn't get another lunch if he gave his away, he still gives his away. And because of the little boy doing that, not only does he get to eat, but 10,000 others get to eat too. And the thing is, you may feel that you are a double diminutive. You are the last person to be of use. You think that you're too young or too old, too cynical, too worn out, too different, too loud, too quiet. Listen, a little boy was the key to one of the few events to appear in all 4 Gospels. He is talked about, as we're doing this morning, some 2,000 years later. Such was his contribution. A little boy, double diminutive. He couldn't be more minuscule. He couldn't be more minor than he is described as being. I just wonder, in your families, your schools, your friendship groups, your sports teams, your Scrabble groups, your toddler group, your church. Maybe you might be exactly the person that Jesus wants to use. Do not write yourself off. And secondly, the bread. It wasn't the best. In fact, it was the worst, the cheapest, but Jesus uses it. Jesus has a track record of using the worst to make the best. Only John remembers that it was barley loaves, but it's such a great detail. Elsewhere, Mark records Jesus being incredibly moved when a widow puts 2 little coins into the offering in the temple. In fact, Jesus was big about little things. He says that, even if we have just the faith of a mustard seed, which was the smallest seed they knew about back then we could move mountains with that sort of faith. Don't write yourself off, and don't write off what you can give, what you can offer. You might think, well, what could I give? What can I bring? What can I do? You can do something. You can bring something. You can offer something. And that little something could be a huge difference maker. Lastly, a question. Who feeds you? A little later in the chapter, no doubt as they were still thinking about what happened on the hillside, because it must have blown those disciples' minds, Jesus says this to them. He says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he believes in me will never be thirsty. Jesus was saying that only he can satisfy. Elsewhere, he tells a woman at a well that the water she draws from it will only satisfy her for so long. He says that he offers her water that means she'll never be thirsty again. And the testimony of billions of Christians is just that. That finding Jesus, trusting in him and his word, asking him to be the centre of our lives, filling the centre of our lives, has been the most satisfying, the most fulfilling thing in our lives. So the question is, who feeds you? What feeds you? I and the billions of Christians around the world were not genetically weird. Well, not that weird anyway. We all, the truth is, we all have a need for fulfillment. We were created to live fulfilled lives, satisfied lives that bring us contentment and purpose and meaning and nurture and help us to bear fruit. What feeds you? John remembers Jesus taking the lead in the proceedings on that hillside. It's Jesus who takes the loaves. Jesus who took the fish. Jesus is the one who gave it out to the multitudes after he had given thanks. Anyone there would be absolutely crystal clear it was Jesus who had fed them. And I believe he still stands ready to feed and to fill all who would ask. And I simply encourage you, if you've never done it before, to ask. To simply ask Jesus to feed you. To help you to know him. To know his fulfillment, his life, his truth. Ask Jesus to satisfy that bit of you which never seems to have enough. Never seems to be filled by anything else. What have you got to lose? Ask Jesus to feed you. Amen.